Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another in the series of webinars hosted by the Center for Reparation Research at the University of the West Indies. Of course, I want to greet our friends, our members of our advisory board and the network of scholars. And I would, as usual, want to begin with a land acknowledgement from the University of the West Indies. Many of you would not know that the UWI Mona campus recognizes and declares that the land on which we operate as an institution of higher learning is the original or traditional territory of many peoples. The UWI acknowledges the First Nation comprising the indigenous people who were displaced by the Columbus Project and general European colonization, and the hundreds of Africans who toiled for more than 100 years as enslaved people on the old Papede Sugar Estate. The UWI recognizes their labor and sacrifice in preserving this land that has enabled the establishment of a university that now provides opportunities for many of their descendants to receive an education that they themselves were denied. Over the past 3 or so decades, I have personally dedicated my life to the business of education. It is that professional pursuit, alongside being a mother of children who were educated in the Caribbean, that has led me to launch a campaign to examine the education system in which many of us have been educated. This is a largely colonial enterprise. Many schools in the Caribbean were established by churches, and many churches in the Caribbean profited from the enterprise of chattel slavery. Our aim in the Center for Reparation Research, focusing on the CARICOM Reparation 10-point plan, especially points number 6, education programs, number 7, knowledge programs, and number 8, psychological rehabilitation, is to bring attention to the urgent issues around Caribbean sovereignty, decolonization, justice, and repair at the heart of what we talk about as reparatory justice. Let me just remind everyone that the CARICOM Reparation Commission's 10-point plan of 2013, currently being revised, has offered the Caribbean a blueprint for development based on analysis of the lasting legacies of chattel slavery in the region. This development plan provides details on various areas of repair necessary to achieve stability in the region. And of course, from our last webinar, we have been focused on education. We have now, in our 7th installment in our webinar series, we have looked at public health and the legacies of slavery. We have looked at chattel slavery and the implications for reparation. We have looked at orality and the reclamation of spiritual heritage. We've also examined climate justice as reparatory justice. So our aim in the last few months, I would say, has been to spotlight the question also, what does the Caribbean citizen look like in 2035? Many of our countries have Vision 2030, like Jamaica, for example. Various ways in which we have articulated a vision for development. But what does the Caribbean citizen look like in 2035? And I am suggesting that in order to answer that question, it must be that we are looking at education. Now, in our last webinar on education, there were questions raised about decolonization and further indigenizing education and even the assessment. For more than 50 years, we've been transforming an education system that's already troubled. It is riddled with structural inequalities. There are gaps in access. There is need for reform of national curriculum and assessment frameworks. There is even a certain kind of loyalty to colonial language, which I think prevents us from actually accessing some of the ways in which this psychological repair that we talk about and enshrined in CARICOM's 10-point plan can be achieved. Questions about where is our classroom? Is that classroom inside walls that resemble prisons or mental hospitals? Now, this session emphasized the role of education in achieving Caribbean citizenship by 2035, highlighting the need for decolonizing education and addressing colonial legacies. We heard from scholars such as Dr. Moji Anderson, Ms. Cynthia Malone, Dr. David Alston, and Dr. Dion Edwards-Carr, who really lit a fire under the colonial roots of Caribbean education systems and the need for indigenization and reform. Most importantly, she emphasized the need for evaluating curriculum, valuing diverse knowledge systems, and addressing inequalities to prepare students for future challenges. I want to also highlight another important report, or an important report, in fact, specific to Jamaica, the Education Scorecard 2025, Assessing the Present, Guiding the Future of Jamaica, which was recently launched by CAPRI. This is the Caribbean Policy Research Institute on September 17, 2025, very recently. It seeks to take a hard look at the system's progress and persistent gaps. And of course, no surprise, the persistent challenges with equity and access to quality education, especially for vulnerable populations, was one of the things highlighted. We might ask the question, who benefits from a Caribbean education system in shambles? Who benefits from a Caribbean education system in shambles? I want you to, as we are going through this webinar, post your questions in the chat as I introduce our panelists, who will speak in the order that I am introducing them. Nyambe is an Afrocentric community psychologist, associate professor, and coordinator of the psychology program at the University of the Bahamas. Also a certified diversity trainer, her research centers on the application of African epistemology as a tool to empower the African diaspora. She has initiated cultural conservation initiatives, partnered with international conservation groups, organized mental health initiatives in the aftermath of climate change disasters, and served as the International Relations Chair of the Association of Black Psychologists. She has over 25 years of experience leading and serving in nonprofit and grassroots organizations. And her passion for community led to her role as chair of the Bahamas National Reparations Committee. We are very pleased to have Nyambe as one of our speakers today. Dr. Jelani Nair holds a PhD in Cultural Studies and is a senior lecturer in the Institute of Caribbean Studies and the Reggae Studies Unit at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. He coordinates Rastafari Studies initiatives. He has edited and co-edited various special collections and contributed numerous book chapters and articles in various international book projects and journals on Rastafari leadership, reparations, repatriation, reggae music, and cannabis. Dr. Alice Corbell, who I'm hoping will join us in very short order, yes, she is online, is a transdisciplinary scholar activist whose work explores the social justice dimensions of libraries and archives. She is a lecturer in Library and Information Studies and Lever Hume Early Career Fellow at University College London and Visiting Research Fellow with the Center for Rights, Reparations and Anti-Colonial Justice at the University of Sussex. I'm pleased to tell you that the University of the West Indies has now an MOU with the University of Sussex, and we're looking forward to the ways in which we will collaborate on this question of reparatory justice. Her Lever Hume project traces hidden histories and fugitive futures of academic libraries and cultural memory in Caribbean and British higher education, highlighting their overlooked but central role in shaping decolonization agendas and the struggles for epistemic repair. We are pleased to welcome Alice to this conversation. Stephen Golding, a self-professed Garveyite, professor of Garveyism, chaired the Garvey Studies Department at the Heidel University in St. Catherine, Jamaica, and lectures on the philosophy of Marcus Garvey at the primary, secondary, and tertiary levels. He has executively produced media content on both radio and television since the early 2000s, and is also the founding director of Jamaica's only authentic African cuisine restaurant, Cafe Africa. He serves as a member of the Jamaica National Council on Reparations, as well as the Institute of Jamaica Council, and has served as chairman of the African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica and the Jamaica Memory Bank. I want to also mention that Stephen is very much committed to Garveyism and Garvey education in a way that he has recently written a book on Garvey, which will be available to primary level students in very short order. So we will make sure to share the highlights of that for you as well. And I'm sure Stephen will actually speak about this too. Julian Solomon, I'm very pleased to introduce Julian Lee Solomon, is a former student of St. Joseph Convent, Port of Spain, Trinidad, and debater from Trinidad and Tobago with a keen interest in history, international relations, and questions of justice. She joins us today from New Mexico, where she's pursuing higher educational studies. She participated in the Center for Reparations Research debate in 2025, where the team won the competition, further deepening her engagement with the global reparations discourse. Julian is a current student at university. What does UWC mean? I don't know why we have an acronym here that I don't know. And she hopes to bring...
Sorry, it stands for United World Colleges.
Okay, United World Colleges, USA. And she hopes to bring reparations advocacy into that space using the global platform to amplify Caribbean perspectives and youth voices in the movement for justice. Thank you, Julian. Eric Phillips, Mr. Eric Phillips, currently the vice chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission and the chair of the Guyana Reparations Committee. He is an executive member of the African Cultural and Development Association and first president of the African Business Roundtable in Guyana. In 2022, Eric was installed as Chief Sipho Sezulu under Queen Zilikazi of South Africa, Zilikazi. Recently, Eric was elected as the first vice president of the Global African Diaspora Kingdom of Traditional Leaders. We are so pleased to have this distinguished panel today. And in the order that I introduce them, we will begin with Nyambe Campbell-Dean. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to share my screen. Okay, you can see it? Okay.
Yes.
Great. So good afternoon. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. My presentation today is entitled Dis We Tings, Decolonializing Bahamian Education. And I want to jump right in because imagination is one of my favorite things to talk about. And that's in the title of the overall series. So I want to tell my story today in 3 frames. Starting with where we are. I will use the development of education in the Bahamas from its inception to independence to demonstrate how we got here, and end with some findings from my research as an example of where our imaginations can take us with the assistance of reparations. So starting with where we are. I don't know if you can see this clearly, but this was from a Facebook page. It was a secondary school here in the Bahamas, and they said, "Excellence has a look. Pacers Chronicles, they came to school looking like hoodlums, and after sitting in the barber's chair, beautiful." Right? So you might not be able to tell, but the teacher is actually holding the hair of some of the young men who now apparently no longer look like hoodlums because they have shorter hairstyles. And so this has been a very predominant story here in the Bahamas about young men not being able to access schools or being kicked out because of the length of their hair. And I know that there have been conversations in Jamaica recently about young ladies and their hairstyles, specifically in reference to edges, right? So how did we get here, right? How did we get to this space where hair is becoming the grounds upon which students can gain access or not to even get into the classroom? And so if there's nothing else that you remember from my presentation today, I basically want to begin and note this quote from the Seminole Islanders of the Stream by Creighton and Saunders text, in which the authors outline the curriculum in the public and private sector never permitted nor provided for people of African ancestry to know their reality. The institution of formal education in the Bahamas was always more of a directive of colonial powers. It was plagued with instability and had a turbulent inception that consistently relied on foreign influences to help sustain it. As such, the story of Bahamian education can be categorized into three main eras. And so the first of which is catechism. According to Turner, 1968, classroom curricula were more akin to Sunday schools, as Christian catechism was the primary lesson. And I note this Education Act of 1816 here because it required that all teachers be members of the Anglican or Presbyterian church, right? So nothing about their qualifications to teach, but more about their religious affiliations. The second purpose of education for African people in the Bahamas was the second and third was subjugation and colonization. Throughout the 19th century, the desire to propagate colonialist ideals and impart religious knowledge became the motivating factor for the establishment of formal education in the country. And so we see that there was the first non-secular school was opened in 1832. It was closed 3 years later. And it wasn't until the Education Act of 1862 that education became mandatory, but you had to pay for it, and most Bahamians could not afford it. And so we didn't see the creation of the first all-inclusive public secondary education school until 1925. Right? So I tell my students, and they don't really believe me, but your grandparents are really the first generation of Bahamians to have received secondary education. And so we see this playing out, right? When we talk about the underdevelopment, how British underdeveloped the Caribbean, this is what we're talking about, right? That when we look at the fact that in 1957, only 13 years before independence in the country, the Bahamas had the lowest ratio of persons with a secondary education to those with a primary education, right? So this one guy here, he would be the only person out of 67 people that had received a secondary education. And after World War II, heading towards majority rule, we see that Bahamian education took some major strides, but views of it were still limited. So the Houghton Report in 1958 stated that small wonder many prosperous Bahamians seem to think education and training are far from essential for individuals or communities, since they have prospered exceedingly without much of either. And so that was a pretty, myopic view of the way that Bahamians viewed education. But my grandmother, for example, who I dedicate this presentation to, only received a third grade education. She was a straw vendor at the height of the beginning of the boom of the tourism industry. So she and many other women like her helped to build a middle class in the country with their straw work. But even though they weren't formally educated, but they made sure that their children were formally educated, which had some drawbacks because their children then did not learn the skill set that allowed them to educate their own children. So then we moved to 1968, right, with majority rule in the country and this push to Bahamianize education. And so even though there was this push, we see that what that actually meant was not necessarily made readily available for those within the education system. And then you came to 1974, right after independence, and this act was the most comprehensive of its date to establish that Bahamian education needed to be or that education in the Bahamas needed to be Bahamianized and made indigenous. And it also called for the development of a national development plan, as our moderator referred to earlier. So from the passing of the Emancipation Act, in which the motivation to provide education was to simply and explicitly maintain a colonial order amongst the newly freed Africans, to 1957, when the Bahamas had the lowest ratio of persons with a secondary education to those with a primary education in the entire Caribbean, Bahamian education was lacking a truly Bahamian agenda. Majority rule with the establishment of an independent nation created an environment in which the goals of education were able to borrow from the newly found goals of the country. But within this burgeoning culture, persons that could effectively operationalize this concept and then explicate it within education were either few or underutilized. The result was a system that reflects a first-order change in which the names of schools and persons within them were Bahamian, but the curriculums and the agendas remained foreign. And so I just wanted to show this picture of the National Youth Rally. You could see that the stadium was filled. Children were pulled out of school to have a rally for Prince Harry. And that was in 2012. And so the psychosocial history that I just provided came from the overall goal of my research, which was a sequential mixed method study to determine definitions of culturally relevant pedagogy in the Bahamas. And when we think about imagination, right? What could Bahamian schools look like? Or what does the Caribbean person look like when we get to 2035? That this research speaks to that, in saying that at least Bahamian teachers should have a strong cultural knowing. They should be able to design culturally relevant curricula. They should acknowledge cultural differences and be able to minimize cultural differences. And so there's a lot more to this research. I guess y'all just have to invite me back so I can talk about all of it. But it shows that we do have a sense of what we need in our systems, and that we need to be working on systems of education that are indigenous, not just specifically teachers that are able to enact this indigenous education. And so I just wanted to close with an example of the way that could look, that is currently happening, that was released yesterday, a Bahamian textbook with many contributions from people who are well deeped and seeped into indigenizing our education. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Diambe. This is, and I'm so happy that your last slide took us right back to reparations now, because we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we are in this business of repair for a reason. And what we need is reparation now. So you began with the politics of hair. And when I entitled this webinar, Without Apology, engaging with the question of the politics of identity and the link to education, it is exactly these kinds of issues that we would want to be tackling. For too long, people who should be sovereign over their own appearance, over what's growing on their bodies, have been subject to a lot of discrimination that really doesn't belong in the education system at all. What does the length of your hair, even the length of your skirt, the color of your hair, what do those things have to do with your capacity to learn? And so I'm glad that you centered the presentation, or began really, with this question of the politics. But the larger point for me is the way in which you have centered the fact that the curriculum was never meant for peoples of African descent. And that indeed and in fact, we could substitute the country name, Bahamas, we could put Jamaica, Suriname. There are so many ways in which these points you've made apply to the entire region. And it is precisely because of this history of colonialism that colonialism as an enterprise was intent on profit. It was never intended to have people of African descent live and have their being, and to pursue sovereignty and cultural, let's say a common cultural solidarity. And that's where you ended. This narrative could easily have been applied to any Caribbean territory. And the fact that the cultural relevance is where we need to get to in our education system, not to reform the old colonial system, but to move toward a culturally relevant education system. That's real. And you also reminded us that we're not short of solutions. What we might be short of would be some of the resources needed to be able to engage with these solutions. All right, so I want to ask Jelani Naya to then give his own, provide his own intervention on this topic. Over to you, Dr. Naya.
Okay. Thank you very much. Rastafari greetings, brothers and sisters, peace and love. I'd like to start with that video that I shared, if we may. I have 60 seconds that I just want to put in front of us before I begin. You need to unmute that. And to start it at 59. Yeah. We're not hearing. Is anyone hearing?
No.
No.
Okay, still continue because there's a frame which...
But when the players met to shake hands, Ostapenko dropped a verbal bomb.
She told me I have no education, no class, and to see what happens if we play each other outside of the US. I said, I'm excited, bring it on.
No
Okay,
education, no class. That was Ostapenko's parting shot. Townsend didn't mince her words in response. She told Ostapenko to take the loss. The home crowd roared with her.
That's enough, thank you. Okay, I wanted to start with that just to frame what I believe to be the context of our conversation. My own presentation is entitled Breaking the Mental Chains of Civilization. I'd like to start by suggesting that when we think of culture, we normally think of...
It's 13:30.
...the more conventional aspects of culture to do with food and music. But in reality, we hardly ever think of the institutions of spirituality and education as being founded in culture. In fact, the history has been to socialize us away from our culture when it comes to our spirituality and education. To this extent, Jamaica stands as a really good example of the rebel outlaw pariah who, in the language of what Clinton Hutton describes as sovereign learner, curates and develops their own path towards bringing out or nourishing or leading them forward into personalities of potential and knowledge and character. Two brilliant examples of Jamaicans who have come from very humble, perhaps undereducated contexts by way of institutions, but have made their way into the world in ways that very few people will ever imagine. I'm talking specifically of Marcus Garvey and Bob Marley, who perhaps were not the best educated in considering institutions they could have gone to, but come out way ahead of people who would wear their education on their sleeves as honor based on those institutions. The first lesson I would like to suggest that we've been taught by the organic intellectuals, Leonard Howell, the founding father of Rastafari, in his Promise Key, told us to not use the word civilization, use the word Black supremacy. And in this, he suggested that civilization in and of itself was a white supremacist term and intended to keep us in subjugation, essentially. And we see this in that video, which I just shared, where, a Black woman is being dishonored as being uneducated and without class. We understand how the churches particularly drew Black women into institutions, providing more girls' schools than boys' schools in places like Jamaica, to ensure that our women really measured up to European ideas of education and civilization, and therefore set the standard for the Caribbean family. So education has always been a sign of inequity and privilege, and to some extent class. And as to this extent, has never really been a leveling playing field in the way that one might imagine that education is, particularly given how these institutions are founded from European contexts. We are also reminded of the idea of civilization as not a positive thing when we are left to examine Louis Lindsay's work, The Myth of a Civilizing Mission, British Colonialism and the Politics of Symbolic Manipulation, where he elaborates on what Howell is talking about, that bad word civilization, by telling us that the whole myth of modernity and, post colonial or pre-colonial and colonial British occupation has been a politics of manipulating symbols of, crown, of politics, of parliament, of the civilized, to create the aspirations that we saw our early leaders develop when they charted for themselves paths that never really liberated our people. So this idea of civilization, I want to put in front of us as something that we need to think about as we seek to develop our people. The next lesson I would like to suggest comes from Marcus Garvey himself, tied to the idea of civilization, when he tells us that our imperative now is to move forward, to reconstruct men of greater fears, and for that we need to liberate ourselves from mental slavery. The third lesson we learn, I think, comes from Bob Marley, who tells us, don't let them fool you or even try to school you. And this, for me, is a profound statement of the clarity that the education that we are usually given, and he speaks the same kind of dismissal of the leadership of the church, is not positive or progressive to create that idea of the progressive or the free human being. Bob Marley, from his humble origins with his own philosophical intentions and his own spirituality, is now one of the most successful Jamaicans from that kind of social background. So we're reminded by Bob Marley of that very same Garveyism, none but ourselves can free our mind. I want to think about those lessons in the context of the sovereign learner and what Mortimer Planner describes as a new faculty of interpretation. And this new faculty of interpretation actually comes to us as a proposal, as a way of decolonizing tertiary spaces and establishing Rastafari as one of those faculties. Now, Planner also has this idea of polite violence. And to some extent, that was his reading of what the institutional spaces did to us. And we have heard those conversations being echoed by the way they seek to curtail the natural interests of Africans. Here has always been celebrated tradition that has various kinds of applications and value and clothing itself. So the idea of the education system being fixated on the suppression of the African that we are becomes an important conversation that is advanced to us and that we must take seriously. I don't know how my time is going. I didn't take notice of the time, but I want to close with just a reminder from Garvey himself about the very idea of civilization. And he says, if the Negro is not careful, he will drink in all the poison of modern civilization and die from the effects of it. I want to therefore leave with us that our task as people who are parents, educators, leaders in various spaces, is to really introspect and think about what it is that we are setting up for the future. COVID demonstrated that the space of the homeschool at various levels needed to be reconsidered. Personally, for myself as an educator, having to do classes in common spaces with persons who are not necessarily university enrolled, but were party to classes based on the amplification of the classroom in those spaces. Someone like me realized that we need to also think about how university knowledge is shared, and that homeschool, that larger classroom, which constitute audiences that are not necessarily enrolled, becomes a really interesting method of beginning to critique that which we do in very sterile ways. So I would like to leave us with the thought about the institutions of knowledge that we seek to present to our societies, to remind us that the first school is always the home, and that the Caribbean and the Jamaican home in particular is under-resourced in many ways. And in a real sense, the heart of reimagining education really begins with strengthening of the resources of families to effectively create that impetus and the genesis in search for knowledge to strengthen and to build the kind of citizenry that we'd like to have. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Naya. I think your lesson approach is quite fitting. First, being a reminder about what we forget regarding major institutions, whether spiritual or religious, and education system itself, that they are built on notions of culture, and that those notions of culture don't resemble our notions of culture. They are sometimes clashing. I think your emphasis also on language being critical. This is something I mentioned in my opening remarks. coming over from the last webinar that there's a sort of romantic relationship with the language of the colonizer, and we must in fact retrain our minds. And you gave us a classic example that white supremacy means something completely different from civilization. Civilization, a word riddled with questions of taste, standard, status, ultimately, as you have put it, institutions of polite violence. So you have concretized for us the fact that there is no level playing field in the education system, certainly not the one we have been given or founded in European ideals. That there is indeed, as Dewey Lindsay suggests, a myth of a civilizing mission, the irony of which is that we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over, thinking that the systems we have been bequeathed or those we have inherited are somehow going to serve our purposes. Thank you for reminding us through words of Garvey, of Marley, and of Mortimer Plano that we must, in fact, and Clinton Hutton, go back to the idea of sovereign learning, that we are the ones to free our minds, that we know we have been fooled, but more importantly, the strengthening of the home becomes the place to begin. And that's really going back to village. That's really going back to community. That's really going back to the ways in which we must build our societies and our social systems to serve us. All right, I'm gonna go to Alice Corbel now. Remember, in this context, please, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them in the chat. Let us hear from you. Also, remember our past webinars, they are on our YouTube channel, the Center for Reparation Research. Follow us on Instagram to keep abreast of our activities such as these webinars, CRR_UWI. Over to you, Dr. Corbel.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me to join this panel. I've been following these webinars and the work of the Centre for a while now, and yeah, I feel very honoured to be part of the dialogue. I had tried to prepare some slides, but I've been having some technical challenges today, so I'm not able to share them right now. I'm happy to share them afterwards if they can be circulated. But I feel like this is more of a dialogue, and I feel moved to sort of respond to what I've heard so far and tie it into what I'm trying to do in my own work and collaboratively as well. So just off the back of the previous speaker, what came to my mind is the notion of, if we're thinking of libraries, institutions, educational institutions as part of the colonizing system, that the true kind of liberatory learning happens outside of those or outside of those structures. That what we can think about with libraries in my work is that the liberatory space of learning can happen both inside and outside those spaces. And I wanted to just read a tiny bit from this book that's influencing me at the moment, which, oh, I've got the blur on so you can't see it. Let me take that off. There we go. By Ngugi Thiong'o, called Globalised. And it's a different way of thinking about knowledge in a dialectical sense, but thinking through it globally, and rather than dialogue, he talks about multilogues. And I see what we're doing here as a kind of multilogue. And he says in this book, I'm trying to connect it to the idea of identity and knowledge together, and I think he helps us do this. He says, the colonial process dislocates, sorry, I'm struggling with the light. The colonial process dislocates the traveler's mind from the place he or she already knows to a foreign starting point, even with the body still remaining in his or her homeland. It is a process of continuous alienation from the base, continuous process of looking at oneself from the outside or self within the lens of a stranger. one may end up identifying with the foreign base as the starting point towards self, and that is from another self towards oneself, rather than the local being the starting point from self to other selves. And then I'm just going to skip over a bit. He goes on, the colonization of the cognitive process was the everyday experience in a colonial classroom anywhere. In the secondary school phase of the memoirs I'm currently writing, I'm recording the same story, English language, English literature, history and geography first. And then he goes on to talk about, how the British educational model suffused the educational model of all the colonies. And he doesn't talk directly about libraries, but what he's doing in this book is talking about global literatures and languages through that decolonial, anti-colonial lens. So that's my kind of starting point. It's a bit abstract, but it's what came to mind as I was listening to the other speakers, and hopefully it's a way in to what I'm trying to introduce with my own work, which uncovers the centrality of libraries. In the context that I'm looking at is in higher education libraries, so academic libraries, but you can make the same argument about school libraries, public libraries, how they are the sort of overlooked but integral infrastructures and nexuses of how these colonial forces and structures operate in education. So, for example, a university would not function or operate without a library. A lot of people think, it's just a repository of books, everything's online now, maybe we can do without libraries, maybe we can stop investing in them. But if that did happen, first of all, loads of operations would cease to function in the production of knowledge and learning. And more crucially, everything is not online. A lot of it isn't even available in print in the Caribbean because the British stole it, or it's been, displaced or replaced. And moreover, it is in the minds and the bodies of the people who run it and who use it. So if we're trying to think about that, what that means in a anti-colonial, decolonial, reparative sense, we need to start with where we are. And that's how I started my work as initially as a librarian at the University of Sussex Library. And that was about 6 years ago I started there, just before the pandemic. And then the Black Lives Matter movement and the way that erupted and sort of or maybe not but galvanized imaginations and so-called actions in different educational spaces. And I was also on strike a lot in that period because of this state of higher education in the UK is pretty dire at the moment. And through those processes, I engaged a lot with the students and the academics who were coming into the library and who were part of those struggles. And some of them were involved in a campaign called Decolonise Sussex, and together we started to look at what that means in the context of the library. Now, very long story short, that led me to developing my work. Well, first of all, it was very hard to do that work in the library. It was a lot of pushback. My colleagues and managers did not really want me to do that kind of work. It was not in my job description, but I was trying to do it anyway. And one way I could do it, other than activism, was to apply for research funding to look into the colonial and post-colonial history of our university to understand the libraries. I managed to do that, and unexpectedly led me to this historic connection of Sussex, the University of West Indies. Sorry, it's been a long day here. Through a institutional partnership that began in the mid to late 60s through a centre called the Centre for Multiracial Studies. Now, that's another long story, but at the centre of it was a library, and it was framed at the time by the directors and the librarians as Library of Racial Discovery, which is a slightly problematic term, but for the time it was kind of the language that they used. And so that part of the story led me to researching what I thought was this one historic initiative to look at how we could understand the present transnational flows of knowledge and people through those spaces. But in doing so, I've spent quite a bit of time now in the different UWI campuses and spoken a lot to librarians, archivists, scholars, students, and folks outside of those spaces as well, to try and understand how the library and the archives, both as centers of learning and as spaces of cultural and institutional memory, have informed their own understanding of cultural identity, sovereignty, all the rest of it. And what I've been learning through that is what the previous speaker was saying, is that the problem is in the fabric of the system itself. Yes, there's some brilliant work that goes on with liberatory librarianship and scholarship, but the greatest lessons I learned were from those who had left the institution and found other spaces to do emancipatory work. So one of them was Dr. Erna Brodber, and the work she's been doing in Woodside around cultural memory, heritage, and consciousness around there. There was also the Lloyd Best Institute in Trinidad around epistemic sovereignty and archival memory and action. And I'm now engaging those cases with similar spaces in the UK and beyond. So there's a brilliant organization called Decolonizing the Archive that some of you may have heard of, because they collaborate quite a lot with folks at UWI, and another network called the Liberatory Archives and Memory Network. And together we're trying to look at ways in which these transnational stories and connections can inform the struggles for reparative justice, because archives may be where the receipts of the colonial damage were done, but libraries are the spaces where people can come together and learn another level. And those libraries might not always be the institutional libraries. They might be the yards or the homes or the community spaces, but they need to work together with the institutional forces if there is going to be a reckoning. And for my part, as a white British library activist scholar, I feel like I have, a long-term responsibility to try and agitate around that, but it can only be done collectively. So I'm really glad to be part of this conversation as one part of that process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. You have centered integral infrastructure with a reminder that libraries and institutions such as those holding archives, many in the North, holding critical archives relevant to colonial history and even the neocolonial present, need not be forgotten. How these institutions continue to wield influence, many of us forget that. They have significant resources and are not necessarily undergoing decolonial processes to repair the relations of the past. Thankfully, your own work is moving in the right direction, and there are others, allies in the context of reparatory justice, such as yourself. I think your own conversation is one about recuperating libraries or spaces that can operate as such repositories in a new thrust to repair the past. So thank you for centering these institutions. In fact, one of the things we must also consider is that there is a big difference in the resource allocation. And that is evident in the fact that libraries in spaces within the Caribbean, they are no longer places where people go to visit or to find any kind of material. A lot of the kind of searches we would do, that's online. But there are many institutions, libraries functioning with archives that are well-resourced and well-visited. In fact, massive programming within institutions such as the British Library, for example. So there's a way in which the colonial enterprise stands tall with these institutions, and we must also confront them. There is a way in which we recuperate libraries, I'm saying, or spaces that can operate as repositories in a new thrust for decolonization. So let me go to the professor of Garveyism now, Stephen Golding, for your intervention.
Thanks, Prof. Greetings, everyone. This is being done by the Center for Reparations Research, and I see so many of my reparationist colleagues on the panel. Greetings to you all. Let me also send special greetings to Ms. Julian Solomon, who is, I think, in her first year at my own alma mater, the United World College of the American West. Yes, ma'am, class of 93. So I know what you're going through, you know, and I'm very impressed to hear talk of, activating, reparation awareness on a campus like that, draws students from all over the world. Anyway, where to begin? As Prof mentioned, and I suppose this is probably what she would like me to focus on, I have a new book out, which is called the Daddy Marcus Nursery Rhymes. And it's a play on the old Mother Goose nursery rhymes, infusing, or as we say, repairing the narrative of some of these British nursery rhymes that we are still teaching at the early childhood level, not only in Jamaica, but throughout the English-speaking Caribbean. It's important that we understand that when we talk about reparation, it's not only, payment for crimes committed against our people, but it is also repairing some of the systems that continue to linger, that carry that seed of white supremacy that was endemic to the colonial experience, particularly the ones that involved chattel slavery. And so in terms of Garveyism as a gateway and as a medium to achieving that, it's important for us to understand that Garveyism is not just the life of Marcus Garvey. It's not his biography. It's not his history. In fact, in the nursery rhyme book, as Prof said, is about Garvey. Really, there's only one nursery rhyme in there indirectly connected to the life of Marcus Garvey, but it is more so trying to repair the undertone of white supremacy that we are inculcating in our children from such an early age. If I am allowed to share, let me just run this while I am speaking.
Yes, there you go.
All right, so yeah, I'm just gonna let that run. This book is the product of, over 10 years of teaching Garveyism. In 2009, when I was given charge of the Garvey Studies Department at the Heidel Group of Schools, we started out by formulating curriculum to teach the principles of Garveyism to teachers. The idea was that if we wanted to have Garveyism taught in the schools, we couldn't ask teachers to teach something they themselves hadn't been taught. And so we spent a number of years doing that. And while doing that, it's one thing to do something academically. I come from the other end. So we had to create pilot programs to see how the teachers would then implement the lessons of Garveyism into the different levels of the educational experience. So we did a pilot program in the primary school. We did a pilot program in the high school. We even did a pilot program in the adult correctional facility, the General Penitentiary here in Jamaica, teaching Garveyism as a sort of rehabilitative curriculum. Because, listen, Pan-Africanism is important, and this is the foundation of Garveyism. Garvey's name is sort of branded to a philosophy that preceded him, but a philosophy that he was able to build upon and expound on to such a level that, it reached global standards. Pan-Africanism as a philosophy, was birthed not on the continent of Africa, but really in the belly of the slave ship, where we as Ashanti or Igbo or Zulu, had to put aside our different tribal realities to create and resist the tragic and humane reality that began facing us at that time. And so even though we come out of a colonial system where we know heavy mechanisms of control have been used, from physical punishment in the days of chattel slavery to what Garvey referred to as mental slavery, because we were confined within colonial systems of education, colonial systems of politics, colonial systems of society that bred, preached, right, and promoted white supremacy. So that achievement for the Black man was in the direction of moving away from his real African identity. And that is something that we struggled with for hundreds of years. But it's not all dark, it's not all bad, I should say, because there have been resistance, as we know, and part of resistance was also retention. We have the writings of people like Oluwado Equiano, Kwabena Kogwano, some of the early first people to write about their experience as Africans being kidnapped from Africa and facing, the commercialization of slavery, which we now know became chattel slavery, and the brutality of that. And we've had scholars, Dr. Jelani referred to them as organic intellects, intellectuals, which I haven't heard that term before, Jelani, but I love it. I might have to capture it. But certainly people over the years who have searched and researched and reclaimed and made it available to others, our real story as Africans who have been trafficked, but more so as Africans who created the first civilizations. And we have to mention people like Jamaica's own Joel Augustus Rogers, contemporaries of Marcus Garvey like Arturo Schomburg, John Edward Bruce. These were primarily journalists like Garvey himself, but who were very interested in African history before the interruption of slavery, right? And so it is through them that we have what Jelani also referred to earlier as the philosophy of Black supremacy. Black supremacy really was just a correction of a colonial narrative that said Africans came from nowhere and achieved nothing. It is how we are now able in this 21st century to have leading Pan-Africanists who are able to connect us with the pyramids of Egypt and the ancient civilizations and so forth. So anyway, back to the book. I don't know if Prof's camera coming on means I'm running out of time. I didn't check my time before I started.
No, not at all. Please go ahead.
But early childhood education. This is the first thing that we are putting into the minds of our young people. And one of the easiest teaching mechanisms are nursery rhymes, right? What the Daddy Marcus nursery rhyme book does, apart from repairing the narrative, and when we say repair the narrative, as you can see, the great Ras Makonnen, he had 100,000 men. That is a play on the Grand Old Duke of York, right? He had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill. All of these nursery rhymes that we are still using, and one thing the book does, it gives you the date at the top. Most of these nursery rhymes are coming from the 17th, 18th, 19th century. And it begs the question, then why are our teachers still teaching content from 300-400 years ago that reflected the history of the very same people who were at that time oppressing our own ancestors? And we do not first introduce our children to the fables and the legends and the stories from our own culture, whether it be Jamaican or going all the way back to Africa. The nursery rhyme contains, hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, we changed to a jinga jinga, Angolan queen and zinga, right? Which tells the story of when the Angolan queen met with the Portuguese governor. He didn't offer her a chair, so one of her soldiers had to stoop down and she sat on his back, right? None of the nursery rhymes are made up. They are all based on real historical figures. Cuba Cornwallis is a Jamaican woman, very remarkable in her time, bought herself out of slavery, became known to the Maroons as the Queen of Kingston. He, saved the life of Horatio Nelson and King William IV. Powerful woman in the middle of the 18th century, while most Africans were in chattel slavery, she was running Portland, right? Ask how many Jamaican children, how many have heard their stories. So we turned the old lady who lived by the sea into Cuba Cornwallis. Little Miss Muffet becomes Little Miss Lou, who was cooking her stew with red peas, carrots, and dumpling, right? Caldi, the one you're looking at now, is a play on Mary Had a Little Lamb, which is Caldi Had a Little Goat, which is an actual Ethiopian fable of how coffee was discovered by a shepherd boy and his goat who liked to eat the berries. The priests of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church took note of it and began brewing the drink themselves. So let me stop this now. I pause here because the point I want to make is we understand the system that we've come out of, and we have to take the steps necessary to repair and to reinstill in our children a sense of identity, a sense of confidence, as Marcus Garvey puts it. And we have to reverse, the old colonial attitude towards Africa and things African. It is the reason why I feel that our people have not reached their peak of productivity. And we have done so well as an island. We are a powerhouse in culture, but I believe that by retaining and realigning our educational system to build on what is genetically within us, right? Marcus Garvey said what is hidden and can only be resurrected by our posterity, right? Our rhythm, our soul, our culture, our language, our story, and not history. I think I can stop there. Prof?
Thank you so much, Stephen. You have reminded us of the importance of the foundation of education. Thank you so much for sharing with us Daddy Marcus Nursery Rhymes. The fact is that it is a practical decolonial tool, a move to repairing rooted narrative, what has been rooted in terms of British nursery rhymes. Reparation is also about psychological repair. Nursery rhymes are central to identity through myths of origin, cosmology, stories that center the history of Africans versus the legends of the colonizer. You've reminded us, as you consistently do, that Garveyism is a gateway and a medium to achieving decolonization. I talk about Garveyism as not a sort of side order. It is the main course. And the moment we remember that as Caribbean people is when we're going to absolutely be able to rehabilitate our curriculum. You have shared with us the pilot program. We need more of that. We need more of the centralization of Garveyism and understanding that Garveyism is a rehabilitative curriculum. I spoke earlier of resources that we need, but it is also time for us to reallocate the limited resources that we do have to prioritize our own decolonial needs. Sometimes we think we have limited resources, but the fact is that we should be using those limited resources wisely. You've also allowed us to recall that Pan-Africanism is the only narrative. When we talk about white supremacy, the fact is it is Pan-Africanism that is going to help us to understand not just that there is the counter of Black supremacy, but that as African people, we ought to be looking inside of our communities, at ourselves, through ourselves, in a way that we talk about of and for the people. This is a politics by the people, for the people, of the people. So I want to just also remind you, please share details of the book in the chat for those who would want to access it and to share with others. This is fundamental literature. Let me move now then to Julian Solomon for your intervention. And I must tell you, you are the youngest person we have had in a webinar. Clearly, we have had the International Reparation Debating Competition. I remind all of our viewers that we do have that second iteration of the competition coming up. We launch on October 1. Remind your, if you have friends or colleagues, students in various schools, whether in the Caribbean or in the UK, we want schools to enter. And Julian was on the winning team from St. Joseph's Convent, Port of Spain. And she's going to share with us her own perspectives on education. Over to you, Julian.
Okay, thank you so much. Everyone can hear me, right? I hope.
Yes.
Okay. Firstly, I just want to say, like, because now I'm experiencing an education system that's very different to what I was used to in the Caribbean, because I came out of Cape and then I went to the IB, which is what we do in this school, and this school is very, very different. But I would say, like, one of the biggest differences is, like, what is the goal of education here versus what is the goal of education in the Caribbean, and how much that really dictates what the curriculum is and the kind of students that it produces. Because to me, it feels like the goal of education in the Caribbean, or at least the goal of the students like that I used to go to school with, was to leave the Caribbean and make a better life for themselves outside. And I feel like once that narrative is perpetuated, like, we're never going to really progress as a region. And I feel like the education system doesn't really encourage students to question the norms and, like, the reasons why they think the things they do, and to also understand the colonial past that the Caribbean is rooted in, which is why I believe so many students, like, aspire to leave. And here it's really different. Here the goal of education is very much about building a future, and the fact that you have a part to play, and there really is a big sense of, like, personal responsibility for your country, for yourselves, for your peers. And I don't know, I feel like that could really change a school. But I also wanted to comment on Pan-Africanism and the role that that has to play in education, because I don't know, I think the demographic in Jamaica is very different to the population demographic of Trinidad. And a curriculum, educational curriculum that centers around Pan-Africanism, or, like, where Pan-Africanism has a big role to play. I don't know if that would necessarily help Trinidad, or if it will, like, make Trinidad more divided, because Trinidad, a large part of the population in Trinidad is the Indian diaspora, and already it feels like there's a lot of division between them and the rest of the population, or just the fact that just the many different groups of diasporas they have in Trinidad, there's definitely division there. And I don't know if a curriculum like that could, like, help that division, or if it might create more problems. And I also think that, like, the idea that we need to find our identity under a really large label of just, like, African, as I don't know if that's, like, if it's actually empowering, because here, like, the European people I go to school with, they don't, like, feel the need to say, oh yes, we're all European, like, we're all one, we're all united, to feel confident in themselves and their race and their identity. They're very proud to come from different countries and to be of different ethnicities. They will not say, oh yeah, I'm Bulgarian, I'm Dutch, yeah, we're the same, we're one and the same, we do the same things. No, they're very much about the fact that they're different, they have different cultures and whatnot. I don't understand, like, why the Caribbean can't do that themselves, why we can't find confidence and find security in unique identities and different and separate identities. um Definitely, of course, having pride in, like, where we came from and our Africanness, but to say that it's, like, the same, and to say, like, oh yeah, we go back to Africa and the whatever tribe or all of that stuff, I don't know if that will actually like build us up, because there's also the question of whether or not we are accepted by them as well. And going here and going to school with many people who are actually from Africa, I will say that there's some they don't see you as the same, and they do treat you as different, because at the end of the day it is different. But I do think that, like, obviously becoming closer to and having more pride in what that what what it was and what we did come from is important. But to say that we need to like go back to that now in the present, uh I don't know, I don't really agree with that.
Thank you, Julian. I think that your comments reflect quite a bit of the way in which our education system in the Caribbean has not rooted some of us in the ways that it should. I think you have commented quite correctly on the brain drain in the region as something that is going to be addressed by more or greater rootedness in an understanding of that shared history. And that shared history includes the diversity which you are talking about. That diversity which acknowledges a country like Suriname, where there are at least 7 official, let's say, languages, ethnic groups, recognition of holidays, the diversity that you can find in Trinidad with the same reflection of holidays. The fact is, though, that there are many Indians, particularly from the south of India, who understand themselves to have African descent. And so the diversity that we're talking about is complex. Not many persons are going to understand the world or their place in the world through Pan-Africanism. But as a Caribbean region, what we are suggesting is that history, that problematic, oppressive history, is exactly what explains the ways in which our minds can be divided along the lines of culture, along the lines of religion and spirituality, along the lines of education, along the lines of philosophical questions related to identity. So thank you very much for your intervention. And now for our last speaker, I want to turn to Eric Phillips.
Thank you very much. As an engineer, when I looked at this topic without apology, reimagining Caribbean identity and politics, I sought solutions. And so my approach talks about 3 elements: erase, nurture, enforce. So esteemed colleagues, brothers and sisters of our Caribbean civilization, children of freedom's unyielding fire, I bring you greetings in truth, in memory, and in the will of a greater tomorrow. First, erase. Our Caribbean identity was forged in the furnace of European imperial conquest through the genocide of indigenous peoples, the mafia of African enslavement, indentureship, colonialism, and institutionalized cultural erasure. Our peoples did not inherit systems designed for our liberation. We inherited a colonial apparatus designed for our subordination. At the dawn of independence in the 1960s and 1970s, CARICOM governments inherited a flawed education system, inadequate schools, crumbling under colonial decay, high illiteracy rates, a system of classist, racialized discrimination. The architecture of our schools reveals the prison-like nature of our educational system: alien, barren, choking, and indifferent. As Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, asked in 1971, is it surprising that prisons resemble factories, schools, barracks, hospitals? That's our colonial legacy. Caribbean school systems and institutions have been created and designed to nurture and reward mental slavery. Our school systems were never meant to educate, but to condition, to produce compliant cogs, not conscious citizens. The system deprives us of our histories, our truths, our languages, our religions, and philosophical thought. We're not taught to embrace our ancestry through positive storytelling of the great contributions that our ancestors made to societies. But our colonizers made sure they taught us about their great contributions. The cultural genocide we've long endured started in our schools. These architectural prisons where classrooms resemble carceral states are not crucibles of creativity. They're disciplining machines, not spaces of liberation. So we must erase these colonial vestiges. We must demolish the psychological plantations and reimagine our institutions. Erasure, which is what we must do, is not about forgetting. It is an active removal of embedded lies. Hence, Caribbean people have to embrace their own self-liberation. This begins with the erasure of our inherited Europeanness, Americanness, the dreaded curse of Ham syndrome. We're indigenous, we're African, we're Indian, we're Chinese, we're mixed. We're entrapped by Western colonial systems and institutions that insidiously make difficult the reimagining of ourselves, the reimagining of our identities, the reimagining of our politics, the reimagining of our leadership, and the reimagining of our educational systems. Culture, which is important when it comes to identity. When we speak of a culture of a place, we're talking about far more than its artistic impressions or cultural products, which are literature, music, dance, art, sculpture, theater, film, and sport. All of these are important expressions of culture of any social group and are part of its shared joy in the business of being life. But culture is more than that. Culture is about shared patterns of identity, symbolic meanings, aspiration, and about relationships between individuals and groups within that society. Culture is also about the relationships between ideas and perspectives, about self-respect and a sense of security, about how individuals are socialized and values are formed and transmitted. It is deeply intertwined with structures of power, so we have to erase. Nurture. Without apology, Caribbean identity in politics can only be reimagined if we re-educate ourselves and untie ourselves from the Gordian knot of self-colonization, a path many of our leaders have unconsciously succumbed to. In the shadow of colonial erasure, we must plant seeds and we must nurture them. We must center our children not as passive receptacles, but as active agents in their own education. Their brilliance is not to be managed, but unleashed. This begins with the knowledge of self. Know thyself, Imhotep said. We must reclaim the educational space as a cultural common, a university of Ubuntu, where shared histories become shared futures. Our schools must be infused with the ancestral genius of Lucy or Dinkinesh, who walked the Ethiopian highlands 3.2 million years ago, carrying the DNA of every civilization to come. Let democracy be reimagined by us as a market of collective freedoms. We can't use the old definition of democracy of the West. Democracy is not just a ballot box, but a living dialogue informed by epistemologies, by oral memory, by ritual and reason. Our identity, our politics, our future must be shaped not in the reaction to the West, but in alignment with ourselves. This is the time to nurture our shared histories in schools, our shared values in society, shared knowledge and shared governance. We must move from being lingering fingers to a clenched Caribbean fist, a new Caribbean civilization with our own identity. Third, enforce. What must we enforce? We must enforce our ancestral intelligence, what I call AI, not artificial intelligence, but ancestral intelligence. The moral algorithms of math, truth, balance, order, harmony, law, morality, and justice, those 7 principles. This is our strategic recovery. In terms of reparations, the European nations will not give us reparations easily. Just as slavery was seen as in their national interests, reparations is seen as a national threat. They will deploy diplomatic misdirection, odious economic policies, cultural deception. This is the magnificent masquerade of a geopolitical performance of delay, denial, and disinterest. So without apology, we must reimagine. Their very prosperity is built upon our disposition. This is why we must self-liberate and enforce. We must enforce a new civilizational vision, servant leadership, not strongmen in our politics. The legacy of Ubuntu, I am because we are. We must repair ourselves, for reparations begins with self-repair. We are who we think we are. Within this ancestral framework of unity and community, we can create a new educational paradigm of a strong, resilient Caribbean society. In closing, reparations is an act of self-repair, of self-definition. We are who we think we are, said Jiddu Krishnamurti. Ubuntu, says our ancestors. And as Aunt Mandela ancestrally reminded us, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world, our Caribbean society. Our Caribbean civilization is at risk because we do not even teach Caribbean history in our schools. And yes, we've been given the ancestral roadmap to reimagine our identity, to reimagine our politics, the 7 principles of math. The time has come for our civilization to reimagine, not with apology, but with intellectual sovereignty, spiritual clarity, and strategic audacity. We are keepers of the past, but we are pioneers of the future. This be our rallying cry: erase, nurture, enforce. This is our path. This is our program. This is our promise if we are going to reimagine Caribbean identity and politics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. I think I really love the engineering approach that you have taken to this dialogue, this intervention: erasure, nurture, enforce. Yes, mental slavery is deep, and the conditioning is deep, and that in fact, many of the institutions were intended for disciplining. We saw it from Nyambe's presentation, whether it is hair, whether it is the clothing, the way we think, there was always an intention to discipline, but we must, of course, re-educate ourselves. Redefine words, the very words we use, and I maintain even changing the very languages that we're using. And of course, AI redefined as ancestral intelligence is simply brilliant. The self-liberation, the reimagination, that act of self-repair is our task. Now, I don't see any questions in the chat. I did ask and remind that we should share our questions or comments. Everybody is probably quite wrapped with all of the conversation. And I think now we might want to, I see a long comment here. Thank you, Donate Filbert. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, regarding the first picture shown by Dr. Campbell Dean. There's a comment here about facing the same issue in schools in Curacao and St. Martin. Could it be that at certain international education meetings abroad where hair grooming rules are discussed, these school leaders attend and are instructed to impose restrictions? We don't know. The question to Dr. Campbell Dean: did the Pan-African movement discuss this in the public sphere and with school boards? Perhaps Nyambe might want to respond here.
Well, the narrative coming out of the Ministry of Education is that they are in discussion, right? Because teachers are saying, oh no, it wasn't about the hair, it was about them coming to school on time, or oh no, it wasn't about the hair, it was about, you know, something else in accordance with the hair. But I think that, you know, this is the conversation that's happening this year, but then we can point to instances 5 years ago with a young lady that came to school with her natural hair in a puff and was told that she needed to straighten it, or students who come to school with dreadlocks and are told that they need to cut them, right? So the conversation around hair is one that happens every other year. We see another instance occur. And so while the ministries are not necessarily addressing it head on, I think that it is something that we and the reparations movement can be more vocal about, and put out there in the public sphere with the school boards. And we are in the process of working with our Ministry of Education to come into the schools and have conversations around reparations. Prof. Naya will know that we try to implement the reparations debates and engage some of our schools in that. So we're trying to get these conversations to happen, although it's slow.
Thank you for that response, Nyambe. I see Rodian with a question. Julian raises a salient point in reimagining Caribbean education. How can policymakers and educators adequately account for the diverse demographic realities of the region? I don't know if anybody wants to take that. In the interim, I will add that multiculturalism. There are countries such as Australia, Canada. This is a term that has been used and theorized. We have a template for how it is. Societies such as ours, built on diversity, can in fact become respectful, inclusive. Diversity, inclusion, equality. These are very real issues for us, and ones we must center even as we speak about trying to chart a path forward for the 99.9% peoples of African descent in countries such as Jamaica.
If I may, I want to
yes,
to opine on that, what was mentioned by Julian. And I need to thank her for her clarity. I think she's a good ambassador, not just for herself, but her generation, because what I hear from her sounds to be quite familiar, where I hear increasingly, and it's what someone like Sylvia Winter says, it's toward that human, that increasingly, as His Majesty and Bob Marley later reminds us, that we really have to become one humanity, where the things that separate us are less important than the things that connect us. And I think that is a part of what the curricula really, that's what equity is founded on. And as much as your point, Prof, about the demographics of injustice to African people, and Howell's point about Black supremacy as a source of integrity for humanity, that we have the love of humanity more than ourselves at the center. So we are the ones fit to shape the world based on our human centeredness. We have not been caught up on the exploitation and greed and all of what the last 500 years has represented. And that is, the whole rationale behind the kind of Rastafari interpretation and activism in a serious sense. So I thank her for reminding us that, in places like Trinidad is not the same, and in many of our conversations, we forget that, as it is in Guyana. And as much as the experience of Blackness is what connects us generally as a colonial people, even if you're a Native American, even if you're from the Maori in New Zealand or the Aboriginal people, once you've been colonized, you experience the experience of Blackness. That's what Blackness in the continuum of experience really relates to. but the reminder is the human project. And until the philosophy that holds one race, etc., we know it. So thank you, Julian, for the reminder, which I think is useful.
May I comment?
Sure, go ahead.
I think we have to start redefining who we are. Are we a colonial people with the harms of slavery and indentureship? Or are we a Caribbean people looking forward as how to compete, what our role in the world is, how to realign our economies with our human resources? I think given the past, we know that we are little Europeans. That's our educational system. But we come from a great architecture of knowledge, whether it's Africa, India, China. We have all of this. And we have the opportunity to forge our own Caribbean society using the principles of Ubuntu, the principles of Maat. Otherwise, we become minimized. We are 16 million people in the Caribbean, Haiti, 10 million. We're irrelevant on the global scheme. So unless we start forgetting that we're fingers, we're Indian, we're African, we're Jamaican, we're Trinidadian, and start to think as a Caribbean people with a Caribbean view, with a Caribbean educational system that reforges our identity, an identity that incorporates the best of all that we have. We're going to continue to have the politics of the West in which we are minimal. We'll continue to have economics that are minimal, where we're just a play yard for others. So we'll miss the AI transformation. We need to use our ancestral intelligence, because we were building pyramids and all sorts of things before the West were. Lucy is the DNA of the world. We know there's genius in us. We need to grab this genius and start to forge a new dispensation, a new architecture of thought that makes us Caribbean people, whether we're Indian, Chinese, Spanish-speaking, French people. Without that, we're irrelevant and we have no identity other than colonial Caribbean.
It is indeed about reimagining Caribbean identity. This is why I place the two things together. Education does not exist in a vacuum, cannot exist in a vacuum. In fact, that has been the wrong of the past. And there is space, once we understand Caribbean and the diversity inherent in Caribbean, there is space for it all. So I think this is the longest we've gone so far for one of our webinars, but I want to.
You have a hand, I think.
Oh, we have a hand? Please go ahead, Alice.
Yeah, I don't know if there's time. Are you hoping to wrap up?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Just one point and a question. I don't know if there's time for people to respond to. Oh, sorry, my cat has decided to just join in. So the first thing was around the question of artificial intelligence versus ancestral intelligence. I would reiterate what Mr. Phillips said there and say that should be what is primary in these struggles. Of course, artificial intelligence can be a very useful tool, but I think there's not enough widespread understanding about how that is also reproducing very violent colonial logics, both on a material and epistemic level. But that's the matter for another webinar. What I wanted to ask was about the title of this particular webinar around what was it again? Without apology. Got me thinking about the different meanings of apology and apologetics. So I wanted to ask, like, why you decided to call the webinar that, and what other speakers' thoughts were about that term. Because my own thoughts were, on the one hand, unapologetic is a sort of, a defiance, a reclaiming the fire of the injustice that we need to, fuel to remobilize against these things, and to, reclaim identity, voice, all of those things. On the other hand, it is it is about demanding apology from the colonizer, i.e. Britain in this case, and many other European colonizers, of course, but I'm thinking in the British context. And what's very live around identity issues here in the UK right now is, as there is in so many European and American contexts, is an absolute retrenchment into racist ideology and far-right movements. You know, we've got people painting red and white English flags on the streets in every town and city in the UK right now. You might see it if you just Google it. It's quite disturbing. So the refusal to apologize, and that being the first point on the CARICOM 10-point plan, this refusal, I think, is linked to a different kind of unapologetic, right? And I'm trying to think about the relation between refusal on the one hand being a kind of resistance, and refusal on the other hand as being retrenchment and disavowal and the continuation of imperial power. So sorry, that was quite a lot, but I just thought I'd open it in that direction, given that was the title of the
Can
talk.
I share my interpretation? Probably
Sure.
I'm not a historian. The first point of the 10-point plan is an apology. The Dutch have apologized, others have apologized, and nothing has happened. We need to stop waiting for apologies and reimagine our future. And that's how I was looking forward. How do we reimagine our identity to become globally competitive, to change our politics? And so that's how I interpreted it, rather than waiting about an apology and what comes with that. We need to move forward. We are fighting for reparations. That's a long battle, but we can't stay still. We need to move forward in our own eyes so that we can redefine who we are, not what others think we are. And in that redefinition, we need to figure out how our education system allows us to redefine not only our identity, which is critical, but our politics, because our politics is still British, Westminster side, winner take all. That's not the politics of community that we learned in our history of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you for that intervention, Eric. And so it is that we are back to the beginning, the raison d'etre, in a sense. The question that I had in mind, which Alice put quite rightly, and Eric intervened as well. It is that we can't wait for apologies. We must, in fact, chart this internal repair, self-reparation, internal reparation. And in fact, even while demanding through that diplomatic process, the kind of apology we know we need, and what must ensue beyond apology as a sign of responsibility, of taking responsibility, it is that we have a lot of work to do on ourselves, with ourselves, through ourselves as a Caribbean region. Julian, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say about talking about the apology aspect. I don't think it's necessarily that we need to beg for an apology, or we need this apology, but we need to demand that people who come from these colonizing countries, and just people outside of the Caribbean, need to learn and be aware of the history of their countries, of colonization, of what they did to regions, how they destabilized regions, and not just about the great things that their country did. Because the thing is that we will never get an apology if people don't really understand what occurred during European colonization. Because here you'll find many Europeans are very ignorant about what happened, and they'll say things like, oh, well, my people were slaves many years ago too, but it was a very different type of slavery that occurred between those countries and other regions of the world. Transatlantic slavery was something that's very different. And I think until we demand that that is taught worldwide, and that it's, people are exposed to it, I don't think that we'll ever really get an apology. So yeah, I do think that should be the first important step.
I think your point is spot on. that as we seek to re-engineer and to reimagine our own education system in the Caribbean region, we must also be very clear about the fact that the balancing act requires a reckoning with the histories that have been obliterated almost in these countries. British students are not learning about the atrocities committed by Britain. And it's the same in the other colonial territories. We must, in fact, demand that. So thank you so much for bringing that to our attention as well in this webinar. So I want to ask each speaker now. We have made our interventions. We have responded to questions. As we center again the question, who is the Caribbean citizen in 2035? Reimagining education and identity. Let us now, in your closing remarks, provide some way forward. And you can begin in any order you wish.
There are no takers? I will start.
Eric?
Yes. Our governance structure curriculum has to redefine and reimagine itself. It is an economic union. But before we deal with economics, we should be dealing with who we are and our identity and our politics, because that drives our economics. We're not even trading with ourselves. We don't even love each other in the Caribbean because we see ourselves as fingers in this pan. We need to collectively come together, reform our education system so to reignite the passion of who we are. And I don't think that that's happening. Imagine in Guyana, we don't teach history. Imagine in the Caribbean, we don't teach our own history. So if you want our youth to reimagine themselves and you're not teaching it in schools, no individual group, whether it's Rastafari or homeschooling, will solve the problem. We need to look at the problem holistically. We have enough blueprints to change how we approach our identity building, how we change our economics. And I think it comes back to leadership, servant leadership, and visionary leadership. And so talks like these, I hope, will help to spread that germ of knowledge to our leaders, because it's about leadership. And until our leaders start to understand that we're not Grenada or Jamaica or Trinidad, we're Caribbean people with a common set of shared values because of a common history, we're not going to go far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. Centering Caribbean unity.
Yeah. I'll follow up.
Yeah.
There was a question that was in the Q&A, and the anonymous attendee asked, what can non-policymakers or persons who are not educators do with this knowledge and deep desire to advocate for and influence change? And I think in my closing remarks, I want to speak to that, as well as some of the other things that were mentioned in this seminar today. But starting with this, I think that as we're talking about education, that the whole idea is that we have to kind of rearrange the ways in which we have perceived education and what it is to be and the goals of it. And so when we say things like non-policy makers, that we understand that for most of us in democratic countries within the Caribbean, that while we might not officially be policymakers, that we are the policymakers, right? That we are the people that shape what policies we want. And so that we have to really use our voices in connection, in collaboration, in community, to strengthen them, to make them louder, to say, these are the policies that we want in our schools. You know, when you go to the Ministry of Education, they're saying, oh, we don't know if we have a policy around here, that as communities, we can say, well, here is the policy for here and what here should look like in our schools, so that I think that the way that we influence change is by really just recognizing the power that we do have and finding ways to galvanize that power. And I think that that power also comes from Pan-Africanism, right? And understanding like the strength of our connection to the various continent or to the various countries and the continent of Africa. I understand and I really appreciated Julianne's statement about like questioning Pan-Africanism, but I think that because we have been separated from our core, we don't have the capacity in the same way to say like, well, I'm Ghanaian, so I associate with that. That Pan-Africanism came out of a space of not knowing, right? And using the information that we had to kind of galvanize and bring the strengths that we do have together. So I think that if we like recognize these strengths as a community and our history as a group, that is the way that we can really move forward and promote more culturally relevant ideals in our education and Indigenous education systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Nyambe. Centering the way in which we must reimagine our education systems. Okay, any other closing thoughts?
I could come in here. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go
ahead. And I'll go ahead.
Are you sure?
Yeah,
I don't want to. All right, thank you. I really appreciated what everyone has just said, and it made me think about, I'm going to come back to libraries because it's my whole thing, and whether they're the institutional libraries or a community library or a community learning space. I think what's needed at the local level, wherever we are, wherever we're starting from, is spaces like, we've got spaces online like this where we can have these dialogues, but we need physical spaces in communities and in spaces of learning to come together to learn about these things, not just through the texts, but through speaking and the oral processes. So I'm thinking of Walter Rodney's notion of groundings and how that happened in different spaces, and that we need to find those spaces in communities in order to then mobilize and act at a policy level. And one example of that, well, I've been doing that in different spaces here in the UK in the networks that I'm a part of, but it can be really hard, and I'm sure everyone feels this wherever they are, to find those physical spaces. Like if you're in a university or a school, you're so burnt out doing the whole fueling the neoliberal machine of education that there's no classroom space to meet half the time as well. So you have to do it outside those spaces. And this network that I mentioned, and put a link in the chat, called Liberatory Archives and Memory Network, has had some funding through this brilliant organization called Whose Knowledge, with a question mark. I recommend looking them up. And they've recognized this, and what they've used some of their funding for is to bring these folks together. They've identified, and we've self-identified, different scholar activists, memory workers, artists, librarians, archivists, to come together physically in these spaces for 2 or 3 days. So it's not really a conference, it is a gathering. It's a bit like a groundings. And we start to connect the dots, and we start to see, oh, you're doing this, we're doing that. Actually, that could form an intervention, a governmental intervention. And if that could then start to happen on a more transnational scale, then amazing. But we've got to start where we are. So yeah, that's my small response. Thank you.
Jelani?
Yeah, every time we think about solutions, we think about the things that we don't have and what we need. And I think that if we think about our ancestors, informed from that same AI that we're given as a new interpretation. Before independence, our ancestors were more self-sufficient than we are. They lived longer lives. They had less need for hospitals. Our import bill in terms of food was much less. Many of them, delivered their own children. etc., etc. We are supposed to have progressed to the point that more than 60% of what we eat in Jamaica, where there is no paucity of land, is imported. And not to mention GMO and processed and all of that. And I think that the revolution that we're thinking about in education really is a return to agriculture. The space of agriculture is available widely to us. As I was a child growing up, I would be given seeds at certain points in the year, I think sometime after Christmas, but before Easter. Corn, sorrel, red peas, a few seeds to plant around the yard and water and take care of. The principle of the 1977 Social Action Plan that saw a household equipped with ground food and fruit tree in a small space. I'm not talking about huge spaces. In some instances, people were using, containers to cultivate. At points in our life, the thrust to help yourself was so forceful that entrepreneurs developed with callaloo beds and chicken coops and a range of different things. So I think we have become a little too civilized, that our aspirations are completely air-conditioned, buildings sponsored by Chinese and the Canadians and Europeans and a whole barrage of things that continue to perpetuate cycles of GMO, hospitalization, the range of poisons that civilization, according to Marcus Garvey, is going to inflict on us. I'm saying that, yeah, I think it was you, Chair. The solutions often are right here with us. It's about sometimes re-employing the resources that we have. Land as an issue for us in a post-emancipation, post-independence period has never been engaged. Land is the first capacity you have as a human being. Education is irrelevant because the land can educate you. So I would want to say that we have to radically, the deschooling society, Ivan Illich, that sociologist, is an important imperative for us. I would close there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nair. Deschooling, that we must, in fact, unlearn some things that have been inculcated in us. Eric spoke about, and I did intimate earlier, the disciplining that we have to undiscipline ourselves. And I suppose Rastafari would have been one of the best examples of the kind of rebellion we need to actually do this kind of deschooling. Over to you, Stephen, for the last word.
Thanks, Prof. It's 2025, and it makes me think, 100 years ago, 1925, Marcus Garvey wrote from prison, I think, what some consider his greatest thesis. It was entitled African Fundamentalism. And it begins by saying, the time has come for the Negro to forget about and cast behind him his hero worship and adoration of other races, and to start out immediately to emulate heroes of his own. And it goes on later in that stanza to then say, we must promulgate a doctrine and a literature of our own without any apologies to the powers that be. The right is ours and God's. So, Dr. Corbell was asking earlier about the phrasing of without apology. But Marcus Garvey used the same phrase 100 years ago, right? Without any apology to the powers that be. I think going forward in terms of education and curriculum, we got to be bold, we got to be forthright. And as Jelani was saying, some of the solutions are right in front of us. We need to have a reparative sort of curriculum instilled within the teacher training colleges, first of all. That has to be done to break a new generation out of an old colonial cycle that has lasted for centuries, right? We have to be determined to do that, and we have to be deliberate in how we go about achieving that. And then we have to begin to understand what Garvey was talking about when he said, you know, a racial and cultural education designed for the improvement of our people, attuning them back with themselves to reach their greatest production levels, right? You know, Garvey's phrase of if you have no confidence in self is one that's often quoted, but I don't think we understand how deep it goes in terms of identifying what he would later term unlocking these mental slavery chains, right? The chains that lead to doubt, loss of self-identity, white supremacy. All of this eats away at the fundamental unit of the African family and is responsible for a lot of the problems we have today. So if we're serious about education, we have to look at it more than just simply changing the narrative also, you know. We have to look at how deep it goes in terms of social engineering within our society. You know, most of the crime we have here is black on black crime. What would a sense of Africanness and a sense of confraternity between citizens do in terms of changing the social landscape between the haves and the have-nots, you know? And finally, one of the things we need to address too is the legislation that still lingers in many of our constitutions that is really directed against Africanness and African identity. And then we wouldn't be having issues with hair policies and so forth. So these things have to be taken to the top, and we have to be courageous. As the chair of the Caribbean Reparation Commission says, this is the century of reparations. I think it's only now that we're beginning as a society to understand just how wide reparations covers. You know, it's way beyond a check, it's way beyond an apology, it's way beyond just developing infrastructure. It speaks to a mental transformation in our society.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I think no one could disagree that we are absolutely centralizing a matter of internal repair. No one could disagree that we are also, in the context of centralizing internal repair, in a reparatory justice movement focused on education, it requires leadership. It requires inspired leadership. It requires leadership that is engaged. It requires leadership that is itself decolonized. And perhaps that is our biggest challenge, even as we are reminded throughout this webinar that the solutions we need are with us. The challenges we have certainly can be outweighed and obliterated by the many solutions that we have inside of us. I go back to AI, ancestral intelligence. We must refocus our attention on the strengths that we bring, even as we demand apologies without apology. I want to thank all of you for tuning in, for staying with us. I want to thank our speakers for the contributions they've made. These interventions, I think, are important as we continue to chart the course for repair in our region. We have to do that for ourselves. Stay tuned for the next in a series of webinars put on by the Center for Reparation Research. Follow us on Instagram at CRR_UWI. Tune in for our other webinars on the YouTube channel. You can find us online in various platforms as we continue to do what is our mandate: educate, advocate, and to research. Thank you so much all for joining us today.